Well, we do have an opportunity to open our Bibles once again and continue in our study, in our preparation for the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. The title of our sermon today is Pilate's Dilemma. Pilate's Dilemma. And if you have your Bibles, I invite you to open them once again, and let's turn to Luke chapter 26. Luke chapter 23rd. Let me correct that. Luke chapter 23rd, and we're going to read verses 13 through 25. Luke 23rd, chapter 23, verses 13 through 25. This will be the portion of Scripture in which we come to. This is continuing our study of the events surrounding and leading up to Christ's crucifixion. Again, it's our preparation for the Passover and days of unleavened bread. And before we begin reading, let me just take a moment to set for ourselves this scene. We come to a very impactful moment here as it's recorded by Luke, and we find ourselves here in Luke 23 coming before Pilate. Pilate, the Roman governor at that time. And we find that Pilate is at a crossroads in his life. And not just any crossroad. This is the crossroad of his life, we could say. He is now being confronted, and he stands before the very Son of God, Jesus Christ. And Pilate is now confronted with making a decision with the very life of the Son of God. He had experience, he had heard about Jesus Christ, he had heard the claims of Jesus Christ as the Son of God. He also realizes, though, the fury that is within this crowd and their cry for Christ's death. And now, again, what lays before him is a decision. Will Pilate be brave enough to stand for what is right? Will he be courageous enough to execute what he knows to be justice? Or will he succumb to the evil cries of the crowd, those cries of crucify him? And we're going to see as we get into this narrative, it's going to shine a bright light upon the moral compromises, the moral failures of Pilate this morning. And I'll just put it out there in case I fail to do it later. While we sit here today, miles and miles away from where this scene occurred, while we sit here today, years and years from these events, I want to propose and humbly suggest that we are at this same crossroad that Pilate found himself at then, we find ourselves confronted with today. A reckoning with who Jesus Christ is, a consideration and a belief in his claims, and an examination about what he taught and how those teachings make an impact on the lives of to whom he has come. And so while this is an examination of Pilate, it is absolutely an examination of us today. Pilate's dilemma, ultimately our dilemma. So let's read this together. Luke 23, verses 13 through 25. Let's see how this dilemma unfolds here for Pilate. Luke 23, verse 13. Then Pilate, here's the moment, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, he said to them, You have brought this man, Jesus, to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, Pilate says, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning the things which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent him back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him, by Herod. I will therefore chastise Christ, and release him. For it was necessary for him to release one of them at the feast. Verse 18, now they, after hearing this, they all cried out at once, saying, away with this man, that's Jesus, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for certain rebellion made in the city and murder. So Barabbas had been found guilty of murder. Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to the crowd, but they shouted, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Then Pilate, said to them a third time, why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested, and he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison. That's Barabbas, releases Barabbas, but Pilate, delivered Jesus to their will. Let's stop there. So quite a moment. It's interesting. You may have noticed there in verse 14, Pilate's words, again, that he says that he examined Jesus Christ. You know, in one sense, that's true, of course. And in one sense, you and I sit here week after week, Sabbath after Sabbath, and we examine him. We examine Jesus Christ, don't we? Through his word. But if you're like me, it becomes increasingly aware and obvious that point in fact, week after week, Sabbath after Sabbath, it is Christ who's examining us. And we begin our study at this moment, and as Pilate looks at this man, Jesus Christ, and as he hears the cry of the people for his crucifixion, what is going to be revealed today that it is not so much the trial that is before Pilate, rather it's the trial of Pilate. That's what's happening here. And in this whole exchange here, we see Pilate does a number of things. One of the things that we see at first is that right off the bat, he tried to remove himself of the responsibility. That's what he tried to do. And then we see he's unsuccessful in that. And he begins then in this battle with the crowd. And what we see very clearly is that it's a battle within himself. Frankly, it's a battle within himself of doing the right thing and fear. So what I want us to do today as we go through and take an examination of Pilate, I want us to just be constantly applying it to ourselves. What dilemma is occurring in you? You know to do the right thing, but the outward circumstances and ultimately the fear is looking to move you to do just the opposite. As verse 20 says here, the cries, that outward influence begins to build. I can almost imagine the pace and the volume increases. Crucify him. Perhaps it started off with one individual quietly crucify him. There's the second one, and more people begin to chime in. Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Louder and louder the chants became and entered into Pilate's ears. There's the dilemma, and he's trapped. He's moved to execute justice and do what's right, trapped then between that and this crowd pushing him to exercise injustice and do what he knows is wrong. Faced with the choice to free an innocent man or to turn him over to the venomous crowd. Again, he had already tried to push this decision off on Herod, not even deal with it. If you allow your eyes to go up to verse 6 and 7, you can read of this attempt by Pilate, just simply to get rid of the responsibility. What responsibility decision have you tried to push off rather than face up to making the right decision? Maybe put yourself here in this position. Staying here in chapter 23, verse 6 and 7, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man was a Galilean. Verse 7, and as soon as he knew that Jesus, belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. So let him take care of it. Unfortunately, going down to verse 9, Herod sends him back to Pilate, verse 9 through 12. Then he, that's Herod, questioned Jesus with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. That's Christ. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe. That's a mock coronation, mock king's coronation they put Christ through. And sent him, though, back to Pilate. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. So an unholy union and friendship is established around this persecution of Jesus. So he sends him back to Pilate. So the clock's ticking very loudly for Pilate, louder and louder. The demands are coming, and Pilate is having to make a decision. What am I going to do? You know, if you think about Pilate, Pilate was a Roman. Romans were actually partial to law and justice. They actually favored law. And if you look at the history books, you actually can see that some of our American laws today have their foundation in the law in which Pilate and others even adhered to back then. So Pilate would have had a Roman dislike for gross injustice. He would have had that in him. And since he didn't like injustice, that fact would have pushed him toward, and was pushing him toward, releasing an innocent man. Along with that, Pilate's wife had even expressed to him and given him advice, don't have anything to do with that mockery of justice. Matthew records that fact. Let me just show you that. So keep your marker here in Luke 23, and let's go over to Matthew's account of this very moment. I want to show you this. Matthew 27, verse 19. Keep your marker there in Luke. Just for a moment, let's turn over to Matthew 27, verse 19. We'll see Matthew adds this detail that even Pilate's wife tried to help him with this dilemma. Look what she says. Matthew records Matthew 27, verse 19. It says, while he, Pilate, was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him saying, this is what she said, have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. Let's stop there. That's speaking of Jesus Christ. So unsettling messages, unsettling dreams actually came to Pilate's wife. And she says, you don't want to have anything to do with that mockery, that unjust trial. She says, have nothing to do with that just man, she says. So even she knew perhaps God was inspiring those dreams to come to someone who had influence in Pilate's life and could express and try to help him make the right decision. At this point, there still is free will, and Pilate can still do the right thing. But this is the predicament he finds himself in. If you look at the very next verse there in verse 20, staying here in Matthew, it says, but despite the wife's imploring him to do what's right, it says, but the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Whew. So put yourself in Pilate's shoes for a moment. I want you to leave today with some understanding of Pilate, some closeness to his experience. Pilate's being confronted, seized upon by this crowd. He is presiding over a territory. This is his jurisdiction. He's commissioned to maintain order. He's commissioned to quell any civil unrest or disruption. Justice speaks to him, and it tells him to release Jesus. His wife tells him, release this just man. Again, his conscience is telling him the same thing. We see that Pilate truly knew what to do was the right thing. If we go back to Luke 23 just for a moment, if you kept your marker there, you'll be helped. But Luke 23, verse 13 through 15, we see that in his inner being, he knew what was right and wrong. Here's the struggle. Put yourself here. What are you struggling with in your conscience, in your inner being that you know is the right thing to do? Luke 23, look at verses 13 through 15 again. Luke 23, verse 13. Again, then Pilate, when he had called together, he calls all together the chief priests, the rulers, the people, says to them, you've brought me this man to me as one who misleads the people. And he says, I indeed have examined him in your presence. And here's his conscience here. He directly says, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. Neither did Herod. In fact, I sent him to Herod. He sent him back to me, indeed, with nothing deserving of death, which has been done by him. Okay? So, despite all that's in him, that's moving him to stand up for what's right, the crowd's voices are seemingly winning. And of course, there in verse 21, the cry, verse 21, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Can Pilate bring himself to do what is right? Here's the dilemma. It's Pilate's dilemma again, but I'll tell you, and I'll say it a few times today, it's our dilemma. The reoccurring questions in our minds to men and women throughout history have this dilemma. Can you relate to Pilate in this way? Again, what decisions are before you? What decisions are before you? You know what to do is right, but man, is there incredible pressure to do what is wrong. I read a quote from an article. It was speaking about the experience of a world-class surfer. And I'll read you those professionals that take on these incredible waves. Here's a quote from one of those professionals. Quote, to be on the peak of a wave and to take the drop and commit, in that moment, you're facing all of your fears, unquote. And if you read this article there, I know you've seen this, there is this little speck of a being there at the crest of the wave there. I think it was these huge Hawaiian waves that come, and there they are, the very top. This is massive wave behind them that they're standing on. And I look at that picture and I read it again, to be at the peak of the wave and to take the drop and commit. In that moment, you're facing all of your fears. That's where Pilate was, the peak of the wave. And being asked to face all of his fears and to take on those fears and face them down in order to do what's right. The article went on to say that a surfer, what they can do at that moment is, yes, they can make the drop and commit, but they can also then sit back on their board and kind of sink back into the wave and let it go on without them. Let the wave go on. You know, in that moment on the crest, this is the question for us today. Do we sit back and fade to the back of the wave, or choose to make that drop and make that commitment? What's Pilate going to do? What would you do in this moment if you were confronted with such a person? You know, it's no doubt Pilate had been in this position. He had probably even heard the cries, crucify him, before. He'd probably been in this position, but never like this. This is different. They are crying, crucify him, and demanding death of an innocent man. No crime had been committed by Jesus Christ. And unfortunately, what we're about to see is that he loses the battle. He loses the battle. And if you look at verse 23, you know, almost when you first look at this narrative, you almost look at 23 and say, this is where he lost the battle. Verse 23, and all the voices of these men and chief priests prevailed. And you think to yourself, that's when he lost the battle. That's when the battle was lost. Well, I propose that that's not when the battle was lost. It was actually lost at the beginning of this narrative. And I want to show you this. Right at the onset, that's when he lost the battle. This is often when we lose the battle. You'll notice going up to verse 13 through 16 again, I want to show you Pilate's crucial mistake here. And I want to show you when he actually sat back on the board and let the wave go on without him. Here it is, beginning in verse 13 and 14. He declares Jesus innocent. Pilate calls them all together, verse 13, chief priests, rulers, people. You have brought me this man as one who misleads the people. Indeed, I've examined him. And he says, I have found no fault in this man concerning the things which you accuse him. Very definitive. He builds on this fact, verse 15. Neither did Herod, verse 15, for I sent him back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death was done by him. So good so far. And so now at this point, they must have waited for him to say, therefore, on that basis, I am not going to charge him with anything. Herod did not charge him with anything. Therefore, I release him. That's what they should have heard. They could not believe it, their ears, I'm sure, when verse 16 comes and he says, notice, I will therefore chastise him and release him. What? He should have said, I then therefore dismiss him completely. I'm throwing out the charges. Get out of my courtroom. This man is innocent. I'm sending him out into Jerusalem, a free man. No. Instead of following his convictions to that end, doing what's right, he gets caught up. He gets caught up in the discussion. He gets caught up in this bloodthirsty, wily persecutors here, the crowd. He capitulates to them. He bends to them. He compromises to them. He caters to their evil cries. Again, I will therefore chastise him and release him. And just know, in these crest of the wave moments, dilemmas, we can never compromise with evil. Never. Not in the least bit. Can't leave that door cracked open. Often that's when we lose the battle through small compromises, actually leading up to the sin event. Maybe you're with me at this point. Where have you compromised when these dilemmas are presented to you? Well, I know it's the Sabbath. I'll just go in for a little bit though. I'll just need to check in with the boss. Lost the battle. I can dabble in this little bit of evil, sinful. I can dabble in this little bit of sinful activity. I'm not going full blown in. I wouldn't do that. I'm just going to get to the edge. Lost the battle. At that point, you have set back on your board and you have gone down and the wave has gone on without you. You didn't drop in and commit wholeheartedly. So you'll notice predictably then, verse 18 and 19, now they all are crying out, it says. There's a weakness in Pilate's armor here. Verse 18 and 19, and they all cried out at once, saying, away with this man and release to us Barabbas. Let him go free, who has been thrown in prison for certain rebellion made in the city and for murder. Release the murderer. Verse 17 references there. It was customary at the time of the feast for the governor to release a prisoner. This is the feast, of course, the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread at this time. And I think Pilate probably saw this as another mechanism that he could use to compromise with evil. Maybe this custom will give me the ability to release my responsibility to stand up for justice for Jesus Christ. It's feast time. I'll release a prisoner to you. Why don't I just release you, Jesus of Nazareth, and you can have your way then with the murderer Barabbas. He did not expect them to say no. Let Barabbas go. Set him free. Barabbas, of all people. Insurrectionist, murderer. Release Barabbas. Set him free. Again, Pilate thought he could deal and negotiate and compromise with evil. It never works. So again, this is the moment in which Pilate lost the battle. He wasn't standing firm from the beginning. So we got to think about these things in advance and resolve to stand firm at the beginning. Stand at the crest of the wave. Be committed to do what's right. Verse 20 through 22 summarizes Pilate's second and third attempts to have Jesus released. Verse 20 through 22, Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, that was in his heart. Again, Pilate called out to them, but they shouted, saying, crucify him, crucify him. And then he said to them a third time, why? Why, Pilate says, what evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. Stop there. So he goes back and back to them. In the third attempt, you can just hear how the depth of that question. Why? Why are you asking for this? What crime has he committed? Verse 22 again, I have found no reason for death in him. That's interesting. That's an interesting statement. Did you notice this is an indication of weakening by this time? He is weakening because here in verse 22, this is a slight move from verse 14. Verse 14, at the beginning, he says, I have found no fault with this man. But here in verse 22, well, at the very least, he shouldn't die. That's what he says. I have found no reason for that in death in him. That's different than I have found no fault in him, you see. So what's happening here, he's equivocating. He's allowing the evil voice to soften his resolve. Well, maybe we can find him guilty of something. Surely we can negotiate this, you know. Surely we could all just agree, let's come together and agree upon something other than death. I'll punish him, you know, and then I'll release him. Would that satisfy you? Negotiating with evil. Do we do that? Well, it's not a full-blown sin, you know. It's just a little compromise here. And so I wonder what Pilate was thinking here, you know. So perhaps the scourging will induce sympathy on the part of the evil crowd, and they will compromise with him, and the leaders will compromise, and at the very least, save Jesus from this horrible death. I think that's what he's seeking to do. So I know you're looking for something here. Why don't we just scourge him and let him go? Seemingly a kind gesture at first, you know, but we can't misinterpret this proposal. You know, this is not, let's slap Jesus Christ on the wrist and let him go. No, this is, we're going to scourge him and let him go. No small proposal. Scourging was a brutal thing. Many who went through this scourging process never made it to the stake. They never made it to the tree of crucifixion. They died in the scourging. They died in the flogging. This was a pre-death death, often. Horrible, brutal. I won't go into it, but they would attach them to a pole and at the praetorium, and punishment was torturous implements were applied. Worst of the worst. And again, scourging itself was often fatal. So this is not, well, let me just do something nice for Jesus. No, this is, let's be as brutal as we possibly can be. I find no charge against him. Why don't we flog him? Incredible. Not standing up for what's right. Scourge him for what? For healing the deaf? Scourge him for restoring the legs of the crippled? Scourge him for bringing back a deceased son to his widow mother? Scourge him for calling children to himself, encouraging the disciples to understand of such as the kingdom of God? On what basis does he find themselves to abuse him in this way? We read briefly earlier about them putting a robe on Jesus, an ornate robe, a mock coronation. You can read more about that in Matthew's account. They took a crown, they put a crown on Jesus. It was a crown of thorns, pushed it into his head, took a robe, dressed him up. Horrible. They said to him over and over again, "Hail to the King of the Jews," but struck him in the face and spit at him. You know, some of that text, you just can't even, you got to almost turn your eyes away from it. It's how horrible it is. This is the Lord of glory This is the experience of our Creator, the one who not only breathed life and spoke and the world existed, he breathes life into the very ones who now carry out these heinous acts against him. We sing this hymn. When I look up into the heavens, which thy own fingers framed, and to the moon and to the stars, which were by thee ordained, then I say, what is man that thou shalt be mindful of him? Or what the Son of Man that thou so kind to him should be? This is our very Creator. He standing at the crest of the wave. Prepared to commit for us to the purpose to which he came. And you'll notice verse 23, this scourging but releasing proposal, it's just simply met by more demands and shouts there of crucify him. You know, whenever you negotiate with sin, whenever you negotiate with those who are moving you, attempting to move you to evil, they pick up on compromise very quickly. And I think that's what's happening here. They picked up on Pilate's weakening. He's willing to scourge him. That's interesting. We got him on the ropes. We're not letting down now. We're going to apply even more pressure and get this to the death penalty here. We're not going to accept this. We smell fear. We smell fear. So we want more. Pushing to crucifixion. And so the saddest phrase of all this passage is verse 23. Verse 23, their shouts prevailed. The voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate caves in here. Any last vestiges of courage or moral conscience now gone. Verse 24, so Pilate, verse 24, gave sentence that it should be as they requested. Verse 25, and he released to them the one they requested, that's Barabbas, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. So Jesus would now take the place and take the punishment for the guilty Barabbas. I'll repeat that. Jesus would now take the place and punishment for the guilty Barabbas. This was a foreshadow of what was to come. And when he was there on the stake, this is a precursor to the purpose as to why Jesus Christ came, to ultimately fulfill, to take the place and punishment and condemnation for many guilty, all of humanity. Jesus Christ could have sat back on the board, if you will, and let the wave go. He could have called a legion of angels to come and wipe out the whole mockery. Rather, he voluntarily is delivered up, notice, to their will, ultimately to the will of the Father. Not my will, Father, your will be done. He did this for Pilate. Christ did this for Pilate. Christ did this for all the Pilates in the crowd at that time. And Christ does this for all the future Pilates, if you will. You and I. And you and I are the reason he's ultimately in this scene. It's because he has his name. He has your name. He has your name before him. He has your name engraved on the palms of his hands, soon crucified palms for you. And so again, it's not so much the trial before Pilate, is it? It's the trial of Pilate. And I dare say it's our trial today. We see Pilate in our own experience, don't we? We can find ourselves at the crest of the same wave. What do? That's the question. Do we drop in and commit and do what's right? Or do we do as Pilate did? Push off the decision, negotiate, compromise. To the called men and women today, there is no fading back to this responsibility each and every day. Jesus stood at the court of Pilate, waiting for Pilate to make a decision. One day, Pilate will stand in the court of Jesus Christ. And one day, you and I will stand at the court of Jesus Christ. And on that day, Jesus Christ is not going to be some mere governor. He is going to stand on that day as King and King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he will there, the perfect judge, will pronounce the verdict. And so, as we conclude today, may we come to that day having stood and met the crest of all the waves that come into our lives. And may God the Father and Jesus Christ find time and time again through their help, we were ready to drop in and we were ready to commit despite all the pressure that is against us in this world. So today, let's use this upcoming Passover in the days of unleavened bread to help us in a greater way stand firm for God to the end.